Chapter 9. Macro and Micro Tools. I use two tools inside the StoryGrid universe most often and incorporate the vocabulary we've discussed in this StoryGrid beat. The first is the StoryGrid Foolscap. This is the macro view of our story. It is the tool for putting our entire novel on a single sheet of paper. You can see examples of a foolscap at storygrid.com/story-language. At the top of the foolscap, we enter this information: global genre and the value at stake. Secondary genre, if we have one, and the value at stake. Conventions and obligatory moments for our global genre. Point of view. Global and secondary objects of desire. Controlling idea or theme. Then at the bottom of our foolscap, we lay out each of the quadrants of our story, identifying the 5 commandments of each and noting whether they shift from negative to positive or positive to negative. I think of the foolscap as a way to check the vitals of my story. It's similar to how our visit to the doctor, no matter what it's for, includes a check of our pulse, blood pressure, and breathing. I fill out a foolscap for my story several times through the writing and editing process. I think of the foolscap as a living document that we change as we write and edit. That's totally fine. The goal of the foolscap is not to carve the details in stone from day one, predicting how our story will play out. The goal is first to make sure we understand what kind of story we are telling, and second to ensure our story is moving in a direction and aligning with the genre. The second of these two vital tools in our toolbox is the StoryGrid spreadsheet. This is how we get a micro scene-by-scene view of our story. You can see examples of a spreadsheet at storygrid.com/story-language. For every scene of our story, we fill out the columns with our scene's vitals that tell us if and how well they are working. In the basic StoryGrid spreadsheet, we fill out 14 things for every scene: scene number, word count, how many words are in the scene; story event, a summary of what happens in the scene; value shift, a description of the value that shifts in the scene; polarity shift, does the value shift from positive to negative or negative to positive; turning point, at what point in the scene does the value shift; point of view, from whose point of view is the scene presented; period or time, at what point in time does the scene take place; duration, how much time passes during the scene; location, where does the scene take place; onstage characters, which characters are present in the scene; number of onstage characters, how many of them are there; offstage characters, which characters are mentioned in the scene but are not present and active; number of offstage characters, how many of them are there. Filling out a StoryGrid spreadsheet is its own deep subject, and the details are beyond the scope of this book. When you are ready to dive in and learn more, we have resources available at storygrid.com/story-language. The goal of the spreadsheet is to track at the scene level what is happening in the story. Several benefits flow from doing this work. First, it forces us to look at our scenes and decide if something has happened, and, if so, what value shifted. We want to know if the value shift in the scene impacts our global and secondary genres. When we are in the middle of writing our drafts, we often end up with scenes that don't shift, have an extremely weak shift, or shift in a way that doesn't affect the global or secondary values. These scenes may take us on a detour through exposition or unnecessary events. We can't see this when we simply reread our story. However, we notice these problems easily by dissecting the scene data into columns on the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet also allows us to identify continuity problems. Do we have too many short scenes in a row? Are 5 scenes from one point of view and just 1 scene from another? Do the characters stay in the same location for too long? Are there time gaps in our story that don't make sense? Does a character or an important secondary character appear too infrequently? Again, all of this is easy to miss when reading, but impossible to miss when viewed through the lens of the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet forces us to see what's actually on the page, as opposed to what we think is there. Often it's hard to see what our story has become because we're so close to it. However, as we like to say in the StoryGrid universe, you can't hide from the spreadsheet. The other thing I love about the spreadsheet is its flexibility. You can add columns if you want to track different things. I always add a notes column so I can map out my story. I can add reminders of things I need to fix. This keeps me from getting bogged down trying to address problems while I'm filling out the spreadsheet, which is an easy trap to fall into. I'm going to be honest with you. completing the spreadsheet is a painful process. I dread it every single time I have to do it, but I'm always glad once it's done. It is the single most important tool for finding problems in our story. I'm currently working on the spreadsheet for the first draft of my most recent novel. I'm only a dozen scenes in and have already identified several continuity problems and a scene with no coherent shift. I have a couple dozen notes of things I need to do in the second draft. Once the spreadsheet is done, we have a view of our novel that is impossible to obtain any other way. These two tools, the foolscap and the spreadsheet, give us two important views of our story. Shawn is always recommending that we switch between the macro and micro view when working on our story. If we get stuck on the micro, we zoom out and look at the macro and vice versa. These tools allow us to do that. When I'm stuck on what should happen with a scene and what value should shift, I step back and think about where the scene fits in the sequence, quadrant, or global story. I think about what comes before and after it in the foolscap and which conventions or obligatory moments I could set up. If I'm struggling with the macro view of my story, I can zoom in and look at scenes and sequences to see if they're building in the correct way. These two tools, the foolscap and the spreadsheet, enable us to see our story clearly and identify if it is working on both the macro and micro levels.